Is anybody in here an engineer? A couple of us? All right. I don't know why you guys make things so complicated. I was changing out the headlight lamp on my truck, I don't know, maybe last year or so. And in order to get to the headlight on my truck, I had to remove part of the fan shroud, part of the grill, open a hatch in the wheel well to get to the what? It's a headlight. Like my first truck that I ever had, literally the headlight was one thing. You take it out, you pop in a new one, and you're done. Right? It was simple. Everything was simple. But engineers are always making things more complicated. Now, the other day I was helping my son Ronnie with his car. He has, kind of an older car. He's a, college student, so he's doing what he can do. And he came in the house and he said, "Hey, Dad, my car won't start. I think the battery died." I'm like, "Okay." And he goes, "And by the way, the key is stuck in the ignition." I'm like, "What?" So I go in there and I'm thinking, okay, first let me try to get the key out. And so I'm wrestling this thing and it's not coming out no matter what I do. And I'm really doing what I don't want to break the key off in there and be really, messed up. But, so I'm doing what I can do to get through this thing. And I'm thinking back to, when my wife's car did this back when we were, driving a car that wasn't in the greatest condition. And it was like you had to take the, the cylinder out and replace that thing and get up under the, I'm like, I don't want to do all that. And so I Google it to see, what it might be. And, the internet's saying stuff like, it could be like a switch in the console with like your gear shifter is, because your gear shifter has to tell your key that, it's in park so that you can take your key out. And so I thought, okay, so there's a switch that has to be replaced, maybe a cylinder. This is too much for me. Son, just take it to Frank's, have them fix it, call Papa, borrow his truck. And so that's what he did. So he drove, my dad's truck around and killed the battery in that. But in the process of all this, we're trying to figure out what's going on in his car, right? So it's like, okay, well, I can't get the key out, but let me see if I can jump it first, and then we'll kind of take care of things in order as they go. So it turns out that when the battery dies in his car, it automatically locks the key in the ignition. You can't get the key out, which seems a little dumb to me, but if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. So I said, all right, son, let's try to jump your car. Pop your hood, open the hood. Where's your battery? It's in the trunk, Dad. Okay, well then let's open the trunk. Pushing the button, it's an electric button. So when the battery's dead, you can't pop the trunk. But that's okay, we have a key, except it's stuck in the ignition. So you can't use it to open the trunk. And I'm thinking, this is dumb. So I'm Googling, okay, there's gotta be a secret here or something. And it's like, well, if you need to get to the battery, you could lower the seats and crawl in there. I'm not doing that. You're 18, son, you crawl in there and do that. So, but then I'm Googling a little more. It's like, oh, you can release the key, take off an access panel, under the steering column there. You can get up in there with a screwdriver and you can release a button that takes the key out. I'm thinking, man, this is so complicated to jump a car, right? It's just not making any sense to me. And then I get this brilliant idea. I'm like, wait a minute, I think I saw something. So we opened up the hood and I saw that little stem sticking out by the fuse box there. And I thought, you know what? I'll bet you can use that to jump the car. You put the positive on that, you put the negative on the frame. I tried it, jumped the car, started just like that. Oh, okay. So what it turns out is that I'm so worried about engineers being dumb when I'm dumb. The answer was right there. It was right under the hood. It was plain as day. It was right there. I don't know why that didn't come up when I was Googling stuff. You'd think it would be like, by the way, you don't have to get in the trunk. But that's not what I saw. So the truth is that I'm sitting here wrestling this thing, thinking that engineers are dumb, and I'm actually dumb. The answer was right there in front of me. It was not complicated. It was very simple. And that's the thing, is sometimes we want to make our answers a little bit more complicated than they have to be. And that's the same thing we do with God. The answer to all of our problems is the grace of God. It's that simple. That's the answer to everything we need, is His grace in our lives, and that's it. But we want to make it more complicated. And today we're going to talk about the simplicity of grace, what that means for us, but we're also going to talk about what that means for the nation of Israel and for Jewish people, because that's what Paul talks about in today's text. And it might be a little weird. You might be thinking, why do I need to learn about Jewish people? Why do I need to learn about this? This doesn't have anything to do with me. And if that's your thought, that's why we're going over it. Because it's important that we understand what God did through the nation of Israel, through Jewish people, what He's still doing today, and what He will do with them into the future. So if you're following along with today's YouVersion Bible app, today's message is called Amazing Grace, and my remote went out again. Did I say anything about engineers this morning, by the way? Okay. So today's message is called Amazing Grace. We are going to be in Romans chapter 11, and we're beginning here in verse 1, and then we're going to go through verse 10, then we're going to jump to verse 16 and close out to verse 24. So let's go ahead and hop in. Romans chapter 11, verse 1 says this. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul is coming back to this Israel thing. We've mentioned Israel a couple of times in the book of Romans. Remember, he's writing to Roman Jews, Jewish Christians in the city of Rome. And so he's trying to connect with them on a Jewish level, so we kind of keep coming back to that a little bit. David Wilkerson said this. He said, God's covenant with the church and Israel is unbreakable. Okay, so God doesn't break his covenants. Sometimes we think, oh, Jesus came, new covenant, old one doesn't count anymore. There are still covenants that God has made that he is keeping, including his covenant with the nation of Israel. And here's why that's important. Up until this point in the book of Romans, right, up until like the first century here, Jesus is a turning point. From Abraham to Jesus, God has worked almost exclusively through the nation of Israel. From the moment Israel became a nation, or Abraham was on the scene, God has worked through them almost exclusively. And now, all of a sudden, Jesus comes on the scene. He dies, resurrected, ascends to heaven. And now, this other group of people are coming in called the Gentiles, because salvation is for anyone. And so Paul is writing to these Jewish Christians, and he's trying to get them to understand where he's coming from. But he also knows that this is going to be read by people who are not Jewish Christians, including us. So again, if you're wondering what does Israel have to do with us, it's a waste of time, right? You need to know this. If you grabbed your card on the way in, and here's your first fill in the blank, number 1. God is not finished with Israel. God is not finished with Israel. If you look at the book of Revelation, my note kind of disappeared here, so I'm just going to have to go from memory. But there's a verse in there where it talks about the nations of it. It's the 144,000. How many of us have ever heard of the 144,000 before? Okay. Well, there's a lot of beliefs about who the 144,000 are. So there we go, Revelation 4 through 8. In verse 5, what happens is it starts talking about these 12,000 from each tribe. Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, goes down the whole list, 12,000 from each one, okay? Now, different faiths, including like Jehovah's Witnesses, will say, these are the only saved 144,000. Or some people will say, these are the remaining Christians at the end times that will, turn back to God, 144,000. But it makes it actually pretty clear here that it's made up of 12,000 people from each tribe of Israel. So these are actually Jewish Christians in the future that are going to be doing the work of the saints on the earth. That 144,000 are God's chosen Jewish Christians in the future, okay? So this is not symbolic, it's not twisted, it's not untrue. And see, that's the thing, is a lot of times we think of future things and we remove this idea of the nation of Israel. Matter of fact, for 1,800 years, this was a huge problem for preachers. What do we do with this idea that all of these future texts in the Bible talking about prophecy are talking about the nation of Israel when there is none? Because what happened is after Jesus ascended, from 66 to 73 AD, there was a Jewish revolt against the Romans. And in 70 AD, as part of that, the Jewish temple was torn down, just like Jesus said it would be. Shortly after that, the Kitos War happened, which was there was a Jewish revolt as part of it, from 115 to 117 AD. And later on, there was the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 136 AD. Now that's important because from basically 66 to 136, the nation of Israel still existed and was revolting against Rome. But then they kind of lost out. At the end of that period, Jews were sold off as slaves. They were removed from Jerusalem. They were spread out in the diaspora. So the Jews went everywhere across the globe, but they were no longer a nation with their own land anymore. Israel as a nation ceased to exist. They were still a people, still a culture, still a faith, but they were not a country or a nation anymore. And then from that time forward, there was constant Jewish persecution. As the Catholic Church became more popular, they blamed Jews for killing Jesus, so they went after them. They were massacred by Arab people as Islam became more popular. They were blamed for things like the Black Plague. They were persecuted during the Inquisition. Russians held racist laws against them for centuries and are just finally getting rid of them in the last century. Nazis killed 6 million of them in World War II. So Jews faced a lot of problems. They lost their country, they went through history being persecuted, and yet they still existed as a people. That alone, church, is a miracle. I mean, think about like when people come to the United States. How many generations does it take until their customs are kind of dismissed and they start acting like Americans? Yet the Jewish population for centuries was able to maintain their culture and their faith and their people. That's pretty amazing. But then something happened in 1947. See, up until that point, Britain had been this very powerful empire. It was said that the sun never set on the empire because they had, property, states, whatever, territories. I don't know, I can't think of the word. Colonies, okay. All around the globe, okay? So that at every part during the day, the sun was shining on some part of the British Empire. But after World War II, because of all of the cost it took fighting against the Nazis and stuff, Britain couldn't afford to maintain that empire anymore, and so they started letting go of some of their territories and colonies. And so what happened was they had this little nation that used to be where Israel was, and they didn't know what to do with it, so they kind of just took it off their plate and were like, we're leaving, so United Nations, you guys figure out what to do with this. And the United Nations got together and said, why don't we give it back to the Jews? Why don't we let this become Israel again after 1,800 years of not existing? If that's not a miracle, church, how many times have you seen a people not only preserve themselves for 1,800 years, but cease to be a nation and 1,800 years later be a nation again? That doesn't happen, right? I mean, it's not like we're going to go visit the country of Moab, right? Because those people don't exist. And yet they do when they shouldn't. That's a miracle. So when pastors used to have to preach on how there was going to be a nation of Israel for 1,800 years, they'd be like, I don't know. Israel doesn't exist. I don't know why the Bible's talking about it. So they would say it's symbolic or it's just talking about the people, or they'd come up with some excuse or whatever. But the reality is God was speaking literally. Israel, the actual nation in the future. That's a pretty amazing thing. John C. Hagee said this: how did the Holocaust happen? Because God allowed it to happen. Why did it happen? Because God said, my top priority for the Jewish people is to get them to come back to the land of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean what Hitler did was okay, but God used that evil for a good purpose, which was reinstating Israel as a nation with their own land. Again, the promise that he made to Abraham. So we can see it's pretty clear that God is not done with the nation of Israel yet. Now, let's talk about their current status. What's going on in the nation of Israel today? The people, the Jews. Romans 11:25 tells us this: lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. Brothers, a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay, so there's a problem. Israel, God's chosen people, exist as a nation and as a people and as a culture, but God sent his Messiah, and most of them did not buy into that. Most Jews don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah and their Savior. And Paul is saying it's going to stay that way until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. What does the fullness of the Gentiles mean? That means when every last Christian has been saved. So that means, church, literally there is a person who will be the last Christian to come to Christ. That person might be alive today. That person might be sitting in this room right now. The last Christian. And when that does happen, then things will turn around for the nation of Israel again. Here's your second fill in the blank. Most of Israel will be blind until the last Christian is saved. Most of Israel will be blind until the last Christian is saved. Now that's long-term Israel, okay? Long-term plans from God. But short-term, in the time of writing, Paul is saying even today, in Paul's day, God wasn't done with the Israelites there. In Romans 11:2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. God has not rejected do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So basically, as a whole, Israel rejected their Messiah, okay? So the question is, well, how can God continue to use them? Right? God made his chosen people. They haven't all accepted the Messiah, so how is God going to use the nation of Israel? Well, Paul answers this question with a precedent. He goes all the way back to 1 Kings 19, and he tells the story of Ahab and Jezebel, okay? Now, not a good dude, not a good king. He married Jezebel, who was a Baal worshiper. So she came into the nation of Israel bringing Baal worship, who was a false god. Okay? Now, 1 Kings 16 says that he did more to make God angry than any king before him. All right? And his Baal-loving wife was murdering God's prophets in Israel, and so God punished them with a huge drought. Okay? So it seems like there's a big problem going on in Israel at that time, right? So what ended up happening was on Mount Carmel, there was a challenge. There was 450 Baal priests or worshipers that came around. They were going to make this offering to Baal, and they ran around. They were cutting themselves. They were doing weird stuff, trying to get this thing to be taken by the god Baal, and it was never taken. And then Elijah walks up by himself and says, hey, here's the sacrifice for God. The thing lights up and is totally consumed by God. And when Israel sees this, they're like, we're going to believe in God again. Because that didn't make any sense. So quickly, all of a sudden, all the Israelites that were worshiping Baal realized Baal is not the God to be worshipped, and the God of Israel is. And so they all turned to him. But the person that wasn't happy with that was Jezebel. So she starts pursuing Elijah. We're going to kill him. And so Elijah runs off, and he's hiding in the mountains, and he's praying to God, and he's like, God, this isn't fair. They're all worshiping Baal. You know, I'm the only one that's left. Why don't you just kill me? I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me? So that's what he's doing. He's all depressed, and he's like, God, why? Why? And God says to him, Elijah, calm down. You're not the last one. I preserved 7,000 other people in the nation of Israel that have not worshiped Baal. They're still there for me, so calm down. I preserved a remnant. And I wonder, do you ever feel that way? Like you're the only one left? You turn on the news or whatever, you see all these bad things, and it's like, I'm the only believer left, God. Well, God would say to you, calm down. There's still a remnant out there. And that's what Paul is saying in this passage, right? Yes, the nation of Israel has turned away from God. They have not considered Jesus to be their Messiah, and that is a problem, but here's the reality, is God does set aside a remnant. And the remnant are called Messianic Jews. The Jews that do believe that Christ is the Messiah and do worship him. Now, Paul brings it back to the current situation then here in Romans 11:5. That's when he says, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. So yes, Israel rejected the Messiah, just like they did when they worshiped Baal, but God has preserved some. Here's your third fill in the blank. God preserves a remnant of Israel. Now let me ask you this. How do you receive God's grace? You accept the free gift through his son, right? Now, Roman Jews might think that Israel's purpose is empty because they rejected Christ, but actually God preserves Israel through those who have accepted Christ because of God's grace. Okay, so it's his grace that preserves that remnant. So let's look at verse 6 and see what he says. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. See, Paul is drawing this very hard line here that we have to accept as believers. God's grace cannot be earned. You cannot do works to earn God's grace. You do your works because you have already received God's grace. Okay, you have no requirement to earn his grace except just to accept the free gift. That's all there is to it. Here's your fourth fill in the blank. Our salvation comes from grace. Salvation doesn't come because you attend church. It doesn't come because you're baptized. It doesn't come through prayer. It doesn't come from refraining from sin or anything else. You have one or the other. You have accepted the grace or you have not. That's it. It's a no strings attached gift, and that's all there is to it. You cannot earn it. H.A. Ironside told a story about Elizabeth I in his book, The Heavenlies. There was a French woman who was hiding out in the queen's, dressing room, waiting for her to come in, and she was going to jump out and stab the queen. But what she didn't know is that there's a rule in the palace that any room that the queen goes into, her maids or servants or whatever have to go in before her, and they check the room to make sure there's nobody in there. So they walked in, they found the French woman, and they carried her and brought her to the queen and threw her down at the queen's feet. And she begged the queen at that moment for grace. Please, your majesty, show me grace. And Elizabeth said, if I show you grace, what promise will you make for the future? And the woman said, grace that hath conditions, grace that is fettered by precautions, is not grace at all. Now that's a pretty bold thing to say, right, in that moment. She begs the queen she was just trying to kill for grace, and the queen says, what are you going to do if I give it to you? She says, it won't be grace then, because there'll be a requirement. Most queens would be like, off with her head, right, and be like, done with it. But instead, Elizabeth said, you're right, I pardon you by my grace, and let her go. It's said that that woman became a strong supporter of Elizabeth from that point forward. Grace changed everything. Church, grace is free, free, free. It doesn't cost you anything. Now watch this, Romans 11:7. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. So Israel didn't get what it wanted, but the elect got it. What was it that Israel was seeking? They were seeking salvation and mercy from God through the Messiah. That's what they were waiting for. But how did they seek it? They were trying to get it through the law. Right? They were trying to obey enough rules to get that grace and mercy from God, but it doesn't work that way. That's not the way to do it. Matter of fact, the harder you try to seek it, the more hardened you become, especially if you start tricking yourself into believing that you've earned it. That's what we saw with the Pharisees, right? They worked so hard and they thought they were doing such a good job that they thought for sure we're going to be saved. We've earned it. But they were wrong. It actually hardened their heart. You know, there's a friend of mine who used to be a Baptist, but now he's a Catholic. And we were having a conversation one day and just talking about theology and how he made the change and why. And I was asking him all these questions about stuff, what about infant baptism? Or why do you believe in papal infallibility? Or why do you pray to Mary? Stuff like that. And in the middle of talking, we got to the subject of purgatory. And I said, why would you believe in purgatory? I mean, how did you go from believing in grace, right, God, unmerited favor of God, to believing in purgatory, a place of punishment in between hell and heaven? How'd you end up there? And he told me straight up, I can't imagine that with all that we do in our lives, all the bad stuff we do, that we would totally get away with it. There has to be some kind of punishment for us in the end. So he just couldn't accept that God's grace would be absolute enough. He's like, no, there's got to be some punishment. Maybe less because we have the Savior, but still punishment before we go to heaven. And it's like, man, I don't get that. Because God talks about grace, this unearned, undeserved favor. In Luke 23:43, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and the thief next to him acknowledges him, and Jesus says, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. He didn't say, after a short stint in purgatory, you'll catch up with me in paradise. No, today. Today, there is no waiting. Right? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord today. Not in some holding cell, not in, the spiritual drunk tank or whatever. You will be with him in heaven because of his grace, absolute grace. When Jesus hung on the cross, it took care of everything. Not most of it. It didn't give us a start. It was everything. God wouldn't waste his time dying on a cross for us just to get the process going. Jesus is worth way more than that. And Israel as a whole never found it. But guess who did find it? The elect. Raise your hand if you're one of the elect. That doesn't mean that you had to be voted in. It means God elected to save you. If you're a Christian, you are one of the elect. So don't be afraid to raise your hand if you're a Christian. Yes, I am one of God's elect. So let me ask you again. Raise your hand if you're one of the elect. It's a good thing. Yes, he elected to save us through his grace and mercy. See, God gave Israel every chance. Over and over and over again, God gives them chance after chance after chance, and they missed it. In Amos 3:2, and this isn't necessarily talking about Jesus, but in Amos 3:2, God said, you only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. God looked at Israel and said, I have done everything for you. You have been my chosen people. You have been my family. Of all the nations out there, you're the only one. He's like, my son was born into your nation. I came to speak only to you. Jesus spent time with the Jews. He taught in the synagogues. He taught in the temples. He had Jewish disciples. He performed miracles for Jewish people. He walked in the Jewish lands. Jewish. He was focused on the nation of Israel. But then Jesus, even as he was here walking with us, he was accused by Jewish Pharisees. He was murdered by the Roman government at the behest of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And so God says, you seek salvation and mercy, but I'm going to give it to someone else. The Gentiles. Those who have not been a part of God's plan. And even with all that, God still takes a portion of Israel and preserves it even today. He didn't just cast them off completely. He preserved that remnant. But as a whole, Jewish people are blinded. Let's look at Romans 11:8. Paul says, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. He's quoting Deuteronomy 29:4, Isaiah 29:10. And basically those things tell us that God can do as he pleases. Yes, they've been blinded, God blinded them, and he can do as he pleases. But Scripture also makes it clear that even when he blinds us, he doesn't take away our responsibility. Verse 9 says, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles as to make Israel jealous. So what actually happened is, did they mess up? Yes. Is God casting that away because of them? No. Instead, God took their sin, their desire to murder the Messiah, and he actually used that to save the world. So God took what they meant for evil and used it for the good of everyone. And as a result of that, his goal is to make Israel jealous. So when they see someday, oh wow, God did that for the Gentiles? I'm jealous. God did that for the people that weren't his chosen people. I want to be a part of that. You know, here Paul is quoting Psalm 69, 22, and 23. And it's a scary, familiar picture. Israel sitting at their banquet table, blessed, celebratory, comfortable. And it was that sense of accomplishment and status for God's chosen people that ruined them. They were so sure of their place that they forgot what they were looking for. Does that sound familiar? A successful country of moral police that forget about their own need for forgiveness. That's something that our nation can learn a lesson from, right? We can quickly fall into Israel's trap ourselves. Then Paul says in verse 16, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Okay, notice that tree symbology there. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, and we're going to pause right there, because I want to make sure we understand what's going on with the tree here. This is very important, okay? God uses the imagery of a tree a lot to tell the story of God's chosen people and salvation. So in Isaiah 6, God describes Israel as a tree that is going to be chopped down and burned. So we see Israel there, healthy, nourished, prospering, everything that God did with God's chosen people, all right? But then we find out that it's going to be chopped down through the process of exile, okay? So we end up with this. Right? So God comes in, chops down the tree, and it talks about being burned, okay? So we're talking about purification here. Pruning the branches, getting rid of all the stuff that has been a blessing that has actually caused problems. Okay, so it's chopped down and then it's burned. If you know anything about forest fires, you know that a forest being burnt down is actually good for new tree growth. Provides new nutrients, takes down things that are in the way so that things can regrow better. All right? So we're talking about Israel having all of its freedoms and blessings removed, and then being purified, okay? So that's God's plan. Israel becomes a burnt stump. But then in Isaiah 11:1, we find out from Isaiah another story about the stump, okay? Isaiah 11:1 says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, okay? So the stump is what's left, and then we see this on the next slide. The stump now has something new growing out of it. What do you think that new thing growing out of that old tree is? Want to guess? Sunday school answer. Everybody say it louder together. Jesus. Yes, we're talking about Jesus. I wish that wasn't the answer. I would have got you there. But no, yes, Jesus, okay? So we see Israel has been chopped down and purified, and from that comes the Messiah, Jesus, this new shoot, this new healthy growth coming out of that old purified portion of Israel. That's pretty interesting. So now there's this new stuff, and then it talks about how it's going to bear fruit, talking about the Jewish Christians. But then look at what Paul just said in that last portion. Right? He talked about these wild olive tree branches getting grafted in. Did you know you can graft plants together? Like you can take two totally different species, put them together, and they will grow together from the same set of roots. I actually watched a video this week, which I thought was really interesting. This guy took a potato plant and grafted into it a tomato plant. So it was one plant growing potatoes and tomatoes. He harvested it, used the potatoes to make fries and the tomatoes to make ketchup. Kind of cool, right? Ketchup and fries from the same plant. That's a good deal. I was wondering if we could do the same thing with animals. I guess that's like eating a burger with cheese on it. I don't know. Anyway, where was I at? Okay, so God makes Israel a tree, right? He purifies it by chopping it down and burning it. Jesus grows out, and now he's going to graft in these wild olive branches. From that original set of roots, something totally separate is going to be grafted in and continue to grow. Guess what those wild olive branches are? Gentiles, us, if you're not Jewish, right? The Gentiles get to come in and get grafted into God's original plan. That original structure is still there. It's still his original plan and God's chosen people, but he takes something wild from the outside and brings it in as part of that new holiness growth. That's pretty amazing. That's why Galatians 3:29 tells us, and if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. We are grafted in as Gentiles. But here's the thing. Anyone can be a part of God's chosen people, but anyone can also be removed. That's because it's not about your nationality. It's not about your works. It's about faith in Christ, period. But we feel like we're struggling with this feeling that we got it all figured out. I don't know if you've seen that or you've done it yourself, where it's this idea of like, well, I have Jesus, I'm good, you Jews messed up, so squash you down. Right? You're missing the point, so you're less than. And we start to boast and think that because we have Jesus that we got everything figured out. But see, Christians have been persecuting Jews for centuries. The early church fathers were doing it. Tertullian, Augustine, John Chrysostom, they all wrote things that were negative about the Jews. The Jewish disabilities came up in the Middle Ages, special laws against them. The Spanish Inquisition, Martin Luther wrote on Jews and their lies, had some pretty nasty stuff to say about that, which I'm actually reading a book right now that talks about how that influenced Hitler, who messed things up and ended up killing the Jews as a result of it. And that hatred for Jews still continues today, even by Christians. And you may wonder, why does it even matter? You may not even like Jews yourself. But here's what Paul says to Christians about Jews. Verse 18, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. Not because you're so great, but through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. You're only grafted in because of your faith. There's nothing else there. So if you start boasting about yourself and you make your faith, your following God about something that is other than your faith, more about self-focus, well, then you can be pruned off just like Israel was. See, we're very fortunate to know Christ, and we become part of that tree because of our faith, not because we're better. And Paul warns us, don't let that build up arrogance in you, but fear. Your version might say something like be afraid or tremble or respect. Remember, you're not grafted in because you're great. You're grafted in because of your faith, because God is so great. D.L. Moody said this, it is well that man cannot save himself, for if a man could only work his own way to heaven, you would never hear the last of it. Why, if a man happens to get a little ahead of his fellows and scrapes a few thousands of dollars together, you'll hear him boast of being a self-made man. I've heard so much of this sort of talk that I am sick and tired of the whole business, and I'm glad that through all eternity in heaven, we will never hear anyone bragging of how he worked his way to get there. We're not self-supported, church. We're upheld by the root, the good remaining parts of Israel. Here's your fifth fill in the blank. We should honor, respect, and appreciate Israel. Right? God's chosen people and the nation. And this is the way that this should affect how we live our lives, church. If you're not Jewish, that doesn't mean this doesn't apply to you, right? We should have certain feelings towards the Jewish people because it is their roots that hold us up. Remember, God said to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. I don't see anything that gives any evidence as to why we shouldn't believe that verse today. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the nation of Israel does. You don't have to be a Christian Zionist or political activist or anything like that. God's going to take care of the political part. He's got that under control. But spiritually, they deserve our reverence and our respect. And we should want God's good and perfect will for them. And it's true, they don't believe in Christ, most of them, and they murdered him. That's true. But I don't know that we're any different. Here's what Paul says about that in verse 22. Note then the kindness and severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen. But God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? So he's saying the Jews can be put right back into God's chosen people, just like we could. The branches were broken off because of their unbelief, but they could be grafted right back in. And God has truly been kind to us. He made a way for us even when we did not believe. He'd given us grace and been patient with us, and so he does the same now for Israel. Now someday every Jew will bow at the feet of Jesus. I'm not saying that they will all be saved, but someday they will recognize that Christ is the Messiah. And although Israel missed it, it's not over for them now or in the future. Israel still has a place in God's plan, and God still grafts Jews back onto the tree today. And one day, all the remaining Jews who are still alive in that day will be grafted in as well. And so instead of criticizing them, I encourage you to ask yourself a question. How can we respect Israel and God's place in the kingdom? And what is my own place in God's kingdom? You ever thought about that? Like sometimes we get hung up on our salvation, it's like all about me. What are my benefits? What do I get out of this? Instead of thinking about what you do, it's like going to work and not doing your job but expecting a paycheck. You know, the idea is like, what is my role in God's kingdom? What do I do here? Should you be volunteering in children's church or leading a life group, or should you become a missionary? Should you be the next big evangelist? The next Billy Graham might be in the room right now, sitting amongst us. Whatever it is that God calls you to do it wholeheartedly, not because you have to, but because God didn't have to have mercy on you. Because Christ chose to show God's amazing grace to you. And so, church, rather than being puffed up or ignoring what's going on in Israel or anything like that, the truth is our responsibility as Christians is to share the love of God with people, because we did not earn our place in the kingdom. It has been given to us out of love, and so we serve out of love as well.